Welcome to vpod.ai. This deep dive is sponsored by Stonefly, your trusted solution provider and advisor in enterprise storage, backup disaster recovery, hyperconverged VMware, Hyper-V, Proxmox cluster, AI servers, SA365, a turnkey security appliance, public and private cloud. Check out stonefly.com for more info.
So most of us have probably come across the Epstein-Barr virus, right? Maybe is, that bout of mono back in the day, or maybe we didn't even know we had it.
Exactly. It's incredibly common.
Well, today we're going to unpack some really fascinating, maybe slightly surprising research connecting this common virus to some more serious health issues.
It really is quite something, considering how widespread EBV is.
Yeah.
And we're still figuring out all the potential, downstream effects it might have.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. So let's dive into this first area then. It looks at EBV's link to encephalitis. That's inflammation of the brain.
Right. So researchers looked back at a whole load of encephalitis cases, hundreds of them actually, trying to see where EBV fits into the picture.
And what did they find? Did it pop up often? Well, out of about 364 patients, they specifically diagnosed 39 cases as EBV-associated encephalitis. But interestingly,
Yes.
they actually detected the virus itself in the cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid around the brain and spine, in 86 patients. That's nearly a quarter.
Wow. Okay. So it's definitely present in a fair few cases of brain inflammation. But the headline finding, for me anyway, was when they compared the EBV ones to encephalitis caused by other related viruses like other herpes viruses.
That's where it got really interesting. Yeah, they found some distinct fingerprints, as you say.
What were they?
Okay, so in the EBV group, the protein levels in that cerebrospinal fluid,
Significantly
higher.
protein.
and the glucose levels, the sugar, significantly lower. These are, pretty noticeable differences in the CSF chemistry.
That is a contrast. What does that tell us? I mean, higher protein, lower sugar compared to other viruses.
Well, the higher protein might suggest maybe a stronger or different kind of inflammatory reaction happening right there in the central nervous system with EBV. And the lower glucose, maybe the virus itself or the body's fight against it, is just using up more energy in that specific area, burning through the fuel faster, perhaps.
Gotcha. And it wasn't just the fluid, right? The brain scans, the MRIs, they showed something too.
That's right. A much higher rate of what's called meningeal involvement.
The meninges.
Yeah.
Those are the membranes covering the brain and spinal cord.
Exactly. So it seems EBV might have more of a tendency to affect these protective layers compared to the other herpes viruses they looked at.
How much more common was it?
It was pretty striking. Around 30% in the EBV cases showed this meningeal involvement on MRI,
30%.
whereas it was only seen in about 6.5% of the cases caused by the other herpes viruses.
That really does suggest EBV is doing something a bit different in the nervous system, doesn't it?
It certainly points that way, yeah. A potentially unique interaction.
So beyond just what the illness looked like, did they figure out who might be more likely to get this specific type of EBV encephalitis? Were there risk factors?
Yes, they identified a few independent risk factors. Older age was one.
Okay. Not too surprising, maybe. Immune systems can weaken.
Right. And along those lines, also HIV infection or having other kinds of immunosuppression not related to cancer.
So a weakened immune system generally is a key factor.
It seems so. And also, perhaps logically, if someone actually had an active EBV infection going on in their peripheral blood, like circulating in their body, that also increased the risk of it getting into the central nervous system.
Right. That makes sense. If it's active elsewhere, it's got more chance to sort of cross over. Did they speculate on how it gets into the brain, I mean?
They did touch on that. They mentioned EBV is what's called a lymphotropic herpes virus.
Lymphotropic, meaning it likes lymphocytes, white blood cells.
Exactly. It prefers to infect those immune cells. So one idea is that if the blood-brain barrier, that protective wall, gets disrupted somehow, then these EBV-infected lymphocytes could potentially sneak through into the central nervous system. They also floated the idea of the brain's own lymphatic system being a possible route. That whole system is something we're still learning a lot about, how the brain clears waste and interacts with the immune system.
Fascinating. And this EBV encephalitis, it doesn't just stay in the brain, does it? They noticed effects on the immune system more broadly.
Yeah, that was another interesting point. They observed lower levels of key T lymphocytes, the CD4 plus NARA plus cells in the blood of these patients.
So fewer of those important immune warrior cells circulating.
Exactly, which suggests the infection in the brain might be having this wider systemic impact possibly drawing down the body's immune resources.
Okay, wow. So that's EBV and encephalitis, pretty specific and sometimes serious neurological picture.
Definitely.
Now, let's switch gears a bit, but stick with EBV. There's this other piece of research looking at that link we've heard about for ages between EBV or mono and multiple sclerosis, MS.
Ah, yes, the EBV-MS connection. It's been debated and studied for a long time.
For years, we know there's some kind of association, but the big question has always been why? Why do some people who get EBV eventually develop MS while most don't?
Precisely, because as we said, over 90% of adults get EBV. But MS, thankfully, affects a much, much smaller number. So what's the difference maker?
And this newer research seems to have maybe found a really important clue, right? Something genetic.
It looked that way.
Okay.
They focused on a specific variant of an immune system gene called HLA-E. The particular version is HLA-E01.801.
HLA-E01.01.
Okay. And they used data from a huge cohort, the UK Biobank, nearly 500,000 people. And they found something pretty significant when they crunched the numbers.
What was the key thing? How does this gene variant connect with having had mono in terms of MS risk?
So here's the crux of it. People carrying this HLA-E01.01 variant did have a higher risk of developing MS.
Okay.
But, and this is the critical part, only if they'd also previously had infectious mononucleosis, the classic mono from EBV.
Whoa. So it's not just the gene on its own, and it's not just having had mono on its own. It's the combination of the two that really seems to ramp up the MS risk.
Exactly. It's that interplay. The gene variant plus the past EBV infection, specifically mono. That combination seems crucial.
How much of the risk did it explain?
Well, get this. For people who had 2 copies of this specific variant, one from each parent, and it also had mono.
Yeah.
That combination accounted for something like 65% of the risk of getting MS.
65%. That's huge. That feels like a major piece of the puzzle.
It really does. It strongly suggests this gene variant modifies how the body handles that EBV infection, influencing long-term MS risk.
So how might it work? What's the theory behind why this HLA-E variant makes someone with a history of mono more susceptible?
Well, the HLA genes are involved in how our immune system presents little pieces of viruses or other things to T cells to get the right response.
Okay, immune signaling, basically.
Right. And the thinking is that this specific HLA-E01.01 variant might make the immune system sort of less effective at controlling the EBV infection properly. Maybe it doesn't display the viral bits correctly or signal danger effectively.
So the EBV hangs around longer, or the immune response is skewed somehow.
Potentially, yes. A less controlled or maybe a smoldering EBV infection in someone with this genetic susceptibility could then, over time, perhaps trigger the autoimmune attack on the nervous system that we see in MS.
It just really highlights how our own genetics can shape our response to something as common as a virus, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This variant seems to create a specific vulnerability, but only when that EBV trigger comes along in the form of mono. It's a classic gene-environment interaction.
Okay, so let's try and connect the dots here. We've got the encephalitis findings and now this potential genetic link between EBV, mono, and MS. What's the big picture for you, the listener?
Well, putting these together, I think it really underscores just how complex the relationship is between this incredibly common virus and our health. It's not always straightforward.
Yeah, it seems like it can play out very differently in different people.
Right. The encephalitis research shows EBV can directly affect the central nervous system in quite specific ways, especially if your immune system is already weakened for some reason. And then the MS research adds this whole other layer, suggesting that even a typical EBV infection, like mono, might set the stage for long-term issues like MS, but if you have a particular genetic susceptibility.
So it reinforces that idea that infections, even ones we barely notice or just dismiss as a bad flu, can have these ripple effects, these longer-term consequences depending on things like our immune status and, increasingly, our genetic code.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
So for you, listening, it means understanding that having had EBV in the past, whether you knew it or not, might have implications down the road. They could be subtle or more significant depending on factors we're still working hard to fully understand.
It definitely shows why scientists keep studying these common viruses, doesn't it? There's still so much to learn about their long game.
No doubt about it.
So wrapping this up, it seems pretty clear that Epstein-Barr virus is, well, it's much more than just the kissing disease virus. It seems to be a potential player in serious conditions like encephalitis, leaving specific clues in the body, and maybe, just maybe, acting as a crucial trigger for MS in people with the right genetic background.
It really does highlight the importance of this ongoing research, yeah. Understanding these complex interactions is key.
Absolutely. And speaking of understanding complex systems and ensuring robust protection, if you're thinking about data security, Stonefly has a really compelling offer right now. It's a 100 TB immutable and air-gapped SSO NAS priced at $8,995. That gives you a seriously secure, isolated space for your critical data, something to consider.
Good to know.
We really encourage you to keep exploring these health topics. Think about how this kind of information might relate to you. Thanks for diving deep with us today on vpod.ai.